So Bernie Sanders gave an interview with the Washington Post, and it was a 2020 candidate forum. I guess they do one at a time. It was with Robert Costa, and right out the gate, Sanders had a little bit of an issue with what how this all was being presented, and I think to a certain extent, this is why Bernie Sanders maintains such an ardent level of support, because his critique is, in many respects, societal. He's not Marianne Williamson, who I think,
is awesome,
has a critique of every single. Well, it's not that all these people probably don't have some critique of society broadly, but do not see it as political. Bernie's critique is broader, and here is just a what do you call this? I want to say like a chuckle-inducing or a light moment of that.
I would like to thank our presenting sponsor, Bank of America. Now, please join me in welcoming Senator Bernie Sanders and the Washington Post's Robert Costa.
Thanks, Bob.
Okay.
Senator Sanders, thanks so much for being here.
Is Bank of America really sponsoring this?
Well, let's just get into the interview.
There you go.
Very, very elegantly handled by Costa. Very smooth.
Yes.
Very not uptight and weird.
Well, I mean, I can understand why. Like, how do you answer that?
Well, I think if you could, laugh a little bit and recognize that you're talking to Bernie Sanders.
Right. Yeah, Banks.
But seriously,
I mean, I
think that is the
Robert
level
Costa
of
is not
institutional
sitting
discomfort
there.
that
Robert
these people
Costa
have.
is not sitting there if he has a ready-made answer to that. Because here's the thing: it doesn't even occur to a lot of people. Like, why wouldn't we get sponsored by a financial institution that is, in many respects, as an industry, and perhaps even like narrowly to that specific bank, responsible for the fact that you're sitting up here running for president in 2020 with such wide support? I mean, the banking industry immiserated millions upon millions upon millions of people. And I don't know, frankly, if Bernie Sanders even thinks about running for president in 2016 were it not for the financial crisis. And so I'm willing to bet that Costa, perfectly nice guy, ever looked at that Bank of America logo up there as he's, getting ready for this and thought, okay, wow, that's ironic. I think it completely came out of nowhere and he had no way to process that.
No, and this is where, concepts that sound so highfalutin but really shouldn't be, that, this is where ideas from somebody like Gramsci about how institutions replicate themselves and how there's a seamlessness. It's not as crude as just the money. Of course, money is incredibly corrupting, but there's that cognitive capture aspect. There's just the image you always use is the water you swim in.
Right.
And Bernie does offend these people so much because he really genuinely has a different perception of the water.
And this is why I think, to a certain extent, so many people are allergic to Sanders, is because the first reaction, I don't know that Costas had this, but the first reaction that many people would have is like, really? Are you really going to question the whole premise of this thing?
Right.
Like, are you really going to make me question the premise of this? And people don't like it.
Absolutely.
People do not like to have to question that premise. I mean, if we turn on Rush Limbaugh right now, if this thing hadn't broken already, and listen to Limbaugh, he deals with the sort of like low end of folks. I don't mean this, it's
You mean
disparagingly.
mentally and-
It's disparaging, but it's not. I don't mean it to sound like haute versus low. I just mean like the less sophisticated version of this, which is when any doubt creeps into your head, I'm going to tell you that doubt is wrong. You expunge that doubt. You don't have to. You see the pictures of the people in the cages. You don't have to think that's wrong. Now, Costas, I'm just using him as a surrogate. I don't know him well enough to even make this thing, but someone like Costas would look at those the people in the cages and go, "That's disgusting," right? But because that just offends the sensibility. Limbaugh's listeners, he'll tell them, "You should not be offended by that. It's perfectly legit." But Costas, again, just using him as a surrogate, are you really going to make me question just our ability to have this conversation?
Or even like look at a Chuck Todd, right?
Chuck Todd is a perfect example.
This is it could be really bad what's happening in those camps, and we should debate it spiritedly. But I'd love to be in a terrain where I'm whining about the quote unquote offensive terminology that somebody's using
Right.
versus the substance and merits of it.
And it's just where people draw this line as to what they're going to actually have to expend some critical thought to. And it is the idea that a logo is on the wall is not that big of a deal. But the fact that they feel comfortable sponsoring it because of what's going on, that there's nothing that's offending the sensibilities of that bank enough, that is a little bit problematic. And they also, but they're marketers, they know we put our logo over Bernie Sanders' right shoulder, it's going to help us.
Prior to working at Majority Report, I was a researcher for Vice News' Business of Life show, which was underwritten by Bank of America. And generally, like I basically had to come up with all the different facts that they would throw to the panelists and have them respond to. When I was compiling the facts for the Bank of America one, the feedback I got was a little bit less on the wide-scale financial fraud angle statistics and more on the personal finance choices statistics. So,
well, Vice, they have a bit of a history of that type of
there's also
editorial stuff, is my understanding.
Rupert Murdoch, too.
All right, so let's hear, with that said, Bernie Sanders is... Bernie Sanders on stage with Robert Costa. You should really go check out the whole forum. This is a pretty good format. Costa's a pretty smart guy. He is right-leaning. He was a full-on Republican years ago. God knows if he still is. I imagine less so. But he wanted to discuss Bernie Sanders about busing. And this moment, I think, is really important because again, it's about the meta performance in many respects. Bernie is not having to hide the ball at all. And I think that is helpful for Sanders.
Let's stick with that race point you just brought up. In 1974, you said that busing policies were well-meaning in theory, but sometimes result in, quote, racial hostility.
What else did I say in that?
Tell me.
No, you got it there. Read it. Read the whole quote.
I don't have the whole quote.
The whole quote is, the federal government doesn't give a shit about African Americans.
Oh, that is true. That's why I didn't include it.
All right, okay. And my point was that I don't think anybody thinks that busing is the solution. What is the solution? What I meant by that quote is that we need to enforce fair housing legislation. I think everybody, whether you're black or you're white, you want your kids to go to a great community school, not to be bused an hour away. That is the goal that we should be striving for. And by the way, we've introduced education, what we call the Thurgood Marshall educational plan, which would significantly improve public education in America and deal with a very serious issue of the growing segregation of schools in American society, something that we have to address very boldly.
And we should say, to my knowledge, nobody else has come out with a plan to address that problem. And
none. And can I just add really briefly, among many areas, including, and I think he's 100% right, every single thing he said, including some of the class dynamics of how the things played in the 70s. But his plan does actually provide for busing as part of it with federal funds as well.
I think a lot of what, and just to bring out his point to a certain extent, the idea is that the reason why our schools are so dramatically segregated is there's a holistic problem, right? That has to do with the criminal justice system to some extent, but also simply has to do with the way that we fund schools and the way that we have had systemic issues over the years, whether by government 50 years ago, 60 years ago, or by private enterprise and banks, for that matter, much more recently. The way that we allow financing, the way that we desegregate, or we segregate neighborhoods in many respects by financing and by income. And the idea is that you need to, just going over his plan is there's elements of his plan that directly go to integrating schools with funding, with tripling Title I funding for at-risk schools, executing and enforcing desegregation rules that have been basically floundering for 50 years,
on
60
the books,
years.
but not enforced.
Exactly. Fund school transportation, so there's some of that busing.
There is some of that.
And charter schools that are for-profit and do not have accountability to local school districts and to states or whatever the mechanism is. Not all charters are the same. And A, and B, charters are not the ends. They're supposedly a means to improving the broader public school education.
They're supposed to be a greenhouse. Have you explained is there anything else? I just want to say really briefly, according to this is in the root, the first thing I pulled up, the four biggest banks in America, JP Morgan Chase, Bank of America, Wells Fargo, and Citigroup, have all settled lawsuits for discriminating against Black and Hispanic customers. Collectively, these banks that have participated in the textbook definition of structural racism hold 1/3 of all deposits in the United States, just adding to the full, the sort of grotesque irony of that sponsorship of that forum, especially with the way Costa also asking him that gotcha question, which was totally misleading, trying to make him sound like Biden after we have the setup of, yes, in fact, Bank of America has admitted structurally racist wrongdoing in its own lawsuit settlements.
What's that South African concept about the racial capitalism or
white monopoly capital?
Yeah, which is just like, it acts like it's a South African thing, but really it's just they did what America did.